We want to welcome everybody to this webinar put on by the Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship. My name is Mike Morris. I'm in the Keough School at the University of Notre Dame. And we have just an outstanding panel to share insights with you today. I want to start off though by first welcoming everybody. I'm going to do a little bit of setup and then introduce our panel. And from there, we'll go through a series of questions that I'll direct to the panel. And then we invite questions from the audience. If you would type those in, we'll try to address as many of those as we can as well. So to kick things off, I'm going to pull up some slides and see if I can, sorry. I hope everybody's able to see the slides. So again, our focus today is poverty, entrepreneurship, and public policy. And can governments make a difference? I want to stress the idea that poverty is a characteristic not of a person, but their situation. And so are there things we can do about their situation? Specifically, is there something that governments can do, is there a role for policy? When we talk about, when we talk about the reality of poverty, over a fifth of the world's population remains in poverty today. In the United States, the numbers have hovered around 14%, below, above. I'll come back to that. But 734 million people live in extreme poverty, less than $1.90 a day. For 1,000 children born, 39 will still die before they're 5 years old. Shockingly, a third of the world's urban population lives in a slum. We had seen some global decline in poverty, principally in a couple countries, since 1990. But with COVID, we see poverty rates are actually up and progress is being undone. In the United States and developed countries in general, in the United States, the poverty rate in 1965, when our president launched the so-called war on poverty, poverty was at 14%. Today, it's at about the same. So we see no change in 60 years. If we look in minority populations, the poverty rates are often 3 times the national average. And the evidence is clear that the gap between rich and poor is actually growing. What's shocking is the amount of money we spend on poverty relative to the results that we're getting. In the United States alone, at all levels of the government, we spend over $1 trillion. Annually, spending per person on poverty continues to rise, and yet we don't see a meaningful change in poverty rates. It's not that spending is inappropriate. It's a critical lifeline. But the bottom line is government spending is not moving large numbers of people out of poverty. And so the question is, are there alternative solutions? Is entrepreneurship a solution? Can it provide a pathway out of poverty? Does it help people survive even if they're not getting out of poverty? Does it make people worse off? When we think about somebody in poverty, it's not just a lack of income. Poverty is a multifaceted, multidimensional phenomenon, which we have tried to translate poverty conditions into what are the unique obstacles the poor face when they try to start a business. And we've grouped these obstacles into literacy gaps, not just reading, writing, and numeracy, but gaps in terms of financial literacy, technological literacy, economic literacy. The poor live with a very short-term mindset. They have to make weekly decisions as to whether to pay the rent or to pay a medical bill. That produces a scarcity mindset that makes it very hard to plan, to think holistically, to think strategically. They face intense non-business pressures, whether that's because of chronic illness of a family member and they're the key caregiver, whether that's crime, whether that's challenges with schools, whether that's housing insecurity or food insecurity, and they lack a safety net. And so these liabilities, which transcend the liabilities of newness and smallness that all entrepreneurs face, have huge implications for the kinds of opportunities they see, the kinds of ventures they start, the ways they approach those ventures. When we look at the question, what do entrepreneurs create? The reality is they create four unique kinds of ventures, which we have labeled survival, lifestyle, managed growth, and aggressive growth. Some of the challenge with public policy is the preoccupation with aggressive growth ventures. The less than 1% of ventures that rapidly scale, create lots of jobs, create lots of intellectual property. What we know about the poor is they create all kinds of ventures, but they disproportionately create survival and lifestyle types of ventures. They create ventures that fall into what we call the commodity trap. Ventures that are not well differentiated, a cleaning business, landscaping business. Ventures that price too low, can't afford equipment and technology, so their unit costs are relatively high, squeezing their margin and limiting their capacity with no bargaining power with suppliers, buying at retail to sell at retail, facing intense competition. So the challenge is, how do people break out of this commodity trap if they're low income and they're trying to start a business? And might policy play a role in this? Clearly, policy is itself a multifaceted thing, and so there are any number of policy levers, from tax credits and tax incentives to income subsidies for people starting businesses, to loan guarantees available in many countries where bank loans to the poor are guaranteed by a government entity, government procurement programs that set aside money for the vendors that are of low income or meet other criteria, vouchers that government pays for entrepreneurs to buy services, accounting services, marketing services, straight out grants, a whole range of regulatory policies, and then straight hands-on business assistance, such as in the United States with the small business development centers around the country. At the same time, there are some challenges with policy. Here I cite some of the research. Policymakers are ill-equipped to understand the role of policy in entrepreneurship. Responsibility for entrepreneurship policy falls across a diverse range of agencies with no real coordination. Policies fostering entrepreneurship are wasteful, don't increase the pool of entrepreneurs, and don't resolve market failures. Regulation that's favorable to entrepreneurship in general can have negative consequences for certain types of ventures, poverty being one of them. Direct financial and other support for startups is less productive than maybe concentrating on ecosystem development. And then finally, and there are other findings, I'm just trying to cite some of the key ones that I think have something to say about this conversation. Policy efforts that remove impediments have greater impact than those providing direct support. So with that foundation in mind, we have a fantastic panel, people who've written important, I think seminal in a number of cases, research on public policy issues as they relate to entrepreneurship in general, and in some instances, entrepreneurship as pursued by those in disadvantaged circumstances. So I'm I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. David Aldrich, who is a professor at Indiana University in the USA, Dr. Benjamin Temkin, who's with the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales in Mexico, Dr. Leticia Vickery at Hofstra University in the United States, Dr. João Leitão at the Technical University of Lisbon in Portugal, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this panel. So welcome, panelists. It's so wonderful to have you with us. I'd like to kick the conversation off by sort of touching on one of those pieces of research I just cited. Policymakers seem to understand entrepreneurship seems to matter for economic development. They seem to be getting that. But do they actually understand entrepreneurship? What are the things policymakers maybe don't understand about entrepreneurship that they should?
I'll be the brave one to jump in first.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day, wherever you are. I'm pleased to be on this panel today with my esteemed colleagues, some of who I grew up on as an academic. And so looking forward to this conversation. For our policymakers, I think I have a unique perspective in that I came a bit from policy. I was first trained as a lawyer, and then I went into a PhD program in business, and specifically in entrepreneurship. And it's at that point that I realized most policymakers are taking a very legalistic perspective when they're looking at policies that need to be in place. And when you're taking a legalistic perspective, it means that you're almost leaning on the side of punitive measures because you're thinking about liability, right? You want to give something positive to the population you're trying to serve. You're trying to meet a specific end, right? And using policy as a means to get to that end. But the top of your concern is minimizing liability, right? Minimizing waste and loss, but still trying to get this outcome. Entrepreneurship cannot survive with that type of approach, right? It cannot thrive with that kind of approach. And because entrepreneurship is so much about embracing risk, not really being certain of the end that you're applying all of these resources through a specific means, it's like the antithesis to what policymakers are trying to do. And so therein is that struggle, right? Policymakers trying to minimize the liability, entrepreneurs really having to embrace liability. So how do you get at policy that understands that? And I think I'll stop there as a basis for my colleagues to share their opinion.
So you're suggesting what I'm hearing is that the net effect of public policy may actually be to discourage or dampen risk taking?
Yeah. I mean, there are some instances where we see policies encouraging, the spirit of it is to encourage innovativeness, right? But in no way will you see a policy saying, we want you to take those risks, because there's a lot of liability involved in that, right? And our government structure is a system of checks and balances. So those checks and balances mean you have a lot of reporting, you have a lot of fear that the risk involved, you can't control risk, right? And so I think that is a key issue to getting at policies that don't really speak to what entrepreneurs need.
Okay, David?
Yeah, Leticia, I really appreciate that very lucid introduction. And it highlights a challenge dealing with both sides of what we're talking about. One is entrepreneurship, which is very heterogeneous and really differs depending on the context that it's in, whether it's an industry, certainly a locational, national, even point in time of history. It's not always the same thing, mean, the other thing is policy. Policy is incredibly heterogeneous. So it's easy to find, of course, anybody can find an example and say, wait a minute, I've seen policy that does exactly that, encourages risk. If you take a pinpoint, for example, the famous Small Business Innovation Research Program that's pinpointed and targeted to get entrepreneurs to take the risk in the valley of death through government grants from the big funding Department of Defense, the EPA, all of the agents, top agencies. And this has been shown to be very effective at either inducing entrepreneurs to embrace the risk or actually reducing the risk that otherwise would be there. We can see that in Bayh-Dole. Now, let me say this. That's about one particular context. High tech and the perceived policy goal was innovation. In fact, innovation in particular sets of, I'd say, industries or context. That's a very different context when we talk about policy in a poverty, where poverty becomes the goal. In fact, you almost don't see those words brought together. But I just want to say that highlights, I think, the problem that both are so policy is not one thing. It's not one group making, certainly just like attorneys are not one kind of attorney. You study the law. There are many kinds of law. And if you go to the wrong attorney for the wrong thing, you're going to find out there's a mismatch. It's the same problem is there with policy as well. So it's very difficult to generalize. And of course, now you and I've only been talking about one country. It's a very big world with a lot of different contexts. So in a way, it's very positive. We can see great examples where policy has done exactly that, been able to induce entrepreneurship to meet a goal. I'll stop by just saying this. Most of my life and career, the priority goals have been, certainly in the developed countries, but even in the less developed countries to some degree, to developing countries, have been, in a way, they're the gold standard of policy priorities, jobs, growth, and productivity. And what Michael's done in this forum and through his work is to reshuffle the priorities and say, wait a minute, there's other important priorities that entrepreneurship could be addressing. And I think what you're saying is surely correct, Lutetia, that policy we don't see lots of great this country.
We're having a little trouble hearing you, David. It's breaking up a bit. I think you're frozen.
He's been able to.
Sue, could you send a note to David and just explain that we're having some trouble with him?
Yes.
Benjamin, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about context. In the year 2000, we finally got a president that came from a different party than the traditional revolutionary Mexican party, which has led Mexico since the revolution. And when he came into power, when he was elected, we had this government decided to follow De Soto's advice. De Soto was this Latin American economist, political science guy who proposed that we should do an effort to push for entrepreneurship as the only way to develop and combat informal employment in Latin America. And this president, Vicente Fox, started a policy called changarrización, which comes from the word changarro in Spanish, which means a small, very small business. And supposedly he was to combat informal employment and generate formal employment, which is defined in Mexico as receiving basically Social Security, which is the health service and some pension arrangements and so forth. And he supposedly was following this idea of promoting enterprise in the informal sector so as to come out from poverty and develop formal employment. And the fact of the matter is that it was 6 years in power, so it ended up with as much informal employment as he started with. So it's clear that the will to do that, it's not necessarily followed by the ability to do that. Just the word changarro, everybody will open his own changarro, is supposedly his own little business, and supposedly that way everything will go right in every direction. And the fact of the matter is, since then, different policies have been tried in Mexico, and even though Mexico has had, as part of the globalization process, as part of the interaction with other countries and so forth, has had periods of economic growth, the fact of the matter is that informal employment has not decreased, and the structural differences between these sectors continue to be there. It has something to do with what we think are the characteristics of people who are in informal employment. And we have to do research. I tried to do some research on that. And it seems that it has something to do not just with the economic and political conditions that you decide about, but also with the characteristics of the population that you're trying to deal with. So I'll leave it at that for now as an introduction to the way these things can be seen from the underdeveloped world point of view.
And Professor Lateo, from a European perspective.
Yes. First of all, thank you. I would like to acknowledge your very gentile invitation. For me, it's an honor to be with our colleagues of panel. And as I told you before, especially with David, if I am allowed, because he is an inspiring person all over my short career. Well, let me say that to try to address your question, based on the experience of Portugal, which is fully integrated in the European Union context, policymakers are increasingly understanding what is entrepreneurship about, because it has been integrated in the last years in several multidimensional policies at the national, regional, and local level. And we have been observing the promotion of qualified forms of entrepreneurship, especially through large-scale entrepreneurship events, for example, Web Summit, or even large entrepreneurship tourism events, and more recently, several initiatives connected with what they call social innovation programs. And especially, and this is connected somehow with the previous research of myself, but of other colleagues in the panel, especially through the creation of what we are calling now university ecosystems, positioning the higher education institutions as development levers and also as change levers. Example of these are the creation of entrepreneurship and innovation vouchers for university entrepreneurs, the creation of research and development consortia with industry, and more recently, the creation of PhD grants, embracing both higher education institutions and non-academic entities, such as companies, labs, agencies, foundations, museums, arts, facilities, and first sector entities. Concerning the most critical things to do, in my point of view, they are related to the availability of financing sources. in different formats, especially seed capital, scalability capital, and venture capital, in my view, specially oriented and targeted to research and development activities, which are of vital importance in later stages of growth of companies, according to previous research. And adding to the previous, if I'm allowed to introduce this topic now, also the creation of green and social financing sources targeted to sustainable entrepreneurship initiatives. They should be a priority in terms of policy, especially for fostering green and digital transition, which are mainstreams of the European policy, but especially for fostering social change based on innovation. And for now, it would be all from my side.
Thank you. So, part of the challenge are the metrics we use and the incentive for policymakers to put money into things that generate jobs, generate intellectual property, things that the ventures of the poor don't do. At the same time, the ventures of the poor represent a rich vehicle for human capital development. They serve market niches that are often ignored by incumbent kinds of firms. They actually create a job for many, many millions of people across the globe. My question is, when we talk about public policy and the contextual factors, if poverty is a context, can policy play a role in enabling entrepreneurship to move people out of poverty? I could, of course, answer my own question, but
okay, I'll take. Can I be listened?
Please go right ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Let me put it this way. Informal employment. I'm talking from the perspective of countries which are basically comparatively underdeveloped, countries that are not the most powerful and the richest and so forth, that may have a 25% rate of people who have unregulated jobs and so forth. So they should be considered to be under informal employment. I'm talking about countries that have a high percentage of underemployment in general. Okay, and there is what the question of the strategy to develop can be to try to develop the formal sector in such a way that it absorbs more and more people brings them from informal employment to formal employment. Okay, and this has been something that has happened in Mexico, for instance, which I have studied, is when there has been economic growth, when there has been development in the formal sector, then this brings about decreases in the informal employment sector. It hasn't happened, at least in the Mexican experience, and I think that it's similar all over Latin America, at least Latin America, is that from within the informal employment sector, there has not been a situation in which informal people cross over to formal employment. Even though, for instance, formal employment includes, in the case of Mexico, particularly medical insurance, which is very important. Okay, and we have had a period during the last government in which a new medical service was founded that receive people not related to their workplace, but receive people just in general. It was called the Seguro Popular, which the new president has closed, as he has closed other programs of previous government. And this medical service did serve people, a lot of people, in informal employment, but it didn't take them out of informal employment. The numbers, the percentages persist, and that means that the informal sector is playing a functional role in the workings of the system. So that, for instance, many people who are in informal employment work in the government, work in big enterprises, but they are not granted the rights that convert you into a formal employer, which basically in Mexico, for instance, means a health security, health insurance, and they don't do it.
Mhm.
So they are trying to create all kinds of solutions, but not give them the social security that also involves pensions and so forth. It's pensions and health insurance. So unless there is a government effort to formalize employment, that is to create conditions which raise the cost of labor and allow people to receive more income, there is no way, this is, in my opinion at least, you do have enterprises that work from the informal sector, but they are usually small enterprise, survival enterprises. As I did in one article that perhaps some of you have read, when you study the people who are in informal employment, they come into, or they are already in a psychological, ideological, whatever situation that doesn't allow them by their own efforts to cross that border. And also, many of the people in the formal sector, big companies and so forth, use this form of production to generate some of the inputs with which they work. So this kind of work is functional to the way these big enterprises work in Latin America, in Mexico, and so forth. So you've had administration after administration after administration. It's not that there is no small enterprise in the informal sector. There is small enterprise in the informal sector, and they do efforts to try to raise up their situation. But so long as the formal sector does not develop, does not grow, does not generate jobs which grant you social security, health security, you're not going to have development. That's why I'm a bit skeptic about making entrepreneurship and kind of ideological solution to problems that are structural to the general economy, which is based on this difference and this overexploitation of people in the informal sector, and therefore lower the cost of work for people who work in the formal sector. Last point. The informal sector is functional to the formal sector because, for instance, people who receive low wages in the formal sector, the only way they can buy clothes, the only way they can buy food, people come out from factories and eat in little non-formal restaurants, and not restaurants in the streets that sell tacos and sell this, tamales and whatever they sell. And that is the way one sector is functional to the other sector, and the policies of the government do not change that because they continue to protect the rights of the owners in the formal sector.
So it seems that's a fascinating perspective in terms of policies that support other social benefits like healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I really appreciate Benjamin's insight into that. And, you know, I think that's consistent with what we've learned in the last decades of studying entrepreneurship, thinking about it, what works, and what the learning is that compared to like some very naive era back in the 1960s, is that entrepreneurs are not they're not islands where they just operate in themselves. Rather, some wise person said it takes a village, maybe to raise a child, but definitely to enable an entrepreneur. And now it's fashionable these days to call it the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think, Benjamin, what you're pointing out is that entrepreneurship is only going to be effective to the degree the ecosystem's there. Now, then the question is, what's in the ecosystem? What you're pointing out is, yes, there's got to be included, but it's surely not the only thing, is formal, some part of the formal economy, some part of functional firms and so on. But I think what your answer responds is that in thinking about policy for entrepreneurship, it's like you can't just rush to the entrepreneurship. And that's probably the brilliant insight about the ecosystem that says things have to be in place. Then the entrepreneurship will work. If there's something missing, crucial components, it's not going to work. I think we can see that. It goes back to my response back to Lutetia. So that's why it seems to work sometimes, doesn't work some other times. And it's not because the entrepreneurs necessarily, or even but it's because of what you could say support system, you could say ecosystem, whatever you call it, structure. I think that's fine. But the point is, government policy or any kind of efforts, they've got to be in tandem with it's a team. It's a team, essentially. And so if there's a missing piece, like you said, but that's surely not the only point. Going back to Yoav's intervention, there the emphasis seems to be on getting the universities with a certain goal. They seem to be the missing part, or one of the missing parts of that. But I think you're on to, if you can see where there's a missing link, that's where policy can make a big difference. And that's even before turning to the entrepreneurs. Get that in place, then the entrepreneurs will flourish.
Lutetia?
I love what you said, David, and I'm going to say the other half of that, right? You can't just rush to the entrepreneur. You can't just rush to the policy either, right? So some, as an extension of what David and Benjamin was saying, you have to have buy-in. Yeah, policy can have a place in moving people out of poverty, especially if we're going to think about entrepreneurship as the mechanism. But buy-in is so important whether you're dealing with formalized entrepreneurs or informal entrepreneurs, right? But informal entrepreneurs, we know that most times there's a distrust of government and formal institutions. And trying to move them in that direction is very hard because of all of the things that Benjamin mentioned, right? And so oftentimes legislators or support organizations, the policies at various levels, right? Because as we agree, David, it's very nuanced, right? They will sometimes policies get set in a bubble. Oh, we have this problem. I have the key solution, right? I'm going to give a small example. Here in Long Island, we're dealing with our government agencies who, with great intention, have done things like alleviating certain fees to apply to vendor platforms. So that way, these vendors have access to more procurement contracts, right? Is that exactly the right solution for our vendors, right? If you talk to the vendors, they might say, we would have preferred you to focus your attention on this instead, right? If you talk to the entrepreneurs, right? So it's like, we jump at policy, but it requires the buy-in of so many stakeholders. Okay, we did something for the entrepreneurs, but the people who are making these procurement contracts available, where's their buy-in? Because they're still giving the contracts to the same entrepreneurs where we're trying to shift resources to other entrepreneurs who have been locked out of these systems, right? And so we needed their buy-in too as a key stakeholder, these what we call anchor institutions. And so I think, like, you can't just rush to entrepreneur, you can't just rush to the structure. Like it takes everything, right? That ecosystem, getting everybody at the table before we set policies that are actually going to work, because it takes everyone's hands on deck and commitment to making a specific change towards a particular end to make sure that it happens.
So if I could just throw
If
in,
I'm allowed just to add something,
please do.
or trying. Well, following my colleagues, in my view, the focus could be like an orchestrating regulation for creating a favorable context. But it's not only ecosystems. I think we can go deep in our conversation. And this for sure needs to be approached through the launching of incentives for fostering different types of entrepreneurship initiatives. So starting with policy at the macro level, reducing direct taxes, eliminating bureaucracy, tackling corruption, which is an issue, increasing transparency and accountability, both at public and private level, and also intensifying the digitalization of public procurement and administrative processes. And of course, stimulating complex ecosystems using somehow known dimensions, the entrepreneurial one, the innovative one, the sustainable one. And at the end, I would suggest to relaunch the concept coming from the Beccatinis and the Marshallian tradition. So relaunching a thinking based on the industrial districts concept. And why I am suggesting so? Because recovering this tradition of thinking, innovation, and also the social capital of people and sustainability issues, they are like a common goal. And these will contribute for increasing the quality of life, but especially for using social innovation as a new glue for the network nodes and connections that we have a limited knowledge about those. And of course, policymakers also fail in understanding so. We are doing some efforts when we do research applied to this, but there is a limited knowledge on how this new glue could act as an endogenous enabler inside the districts, what I would call innovation districts somehow.
Yeah, my experience with quite a few low-income and disadvantaged entrepreneurs is that local ecosystems largely ignore them and certainly are not tailored to their literacy challenges, the other characteristics of poverty I talked about before. David, you've published work that suggests that policies aimed at encouraging more people to start businesses are a waste of money. If we don't think about policies to encourage people to start businesses, but more go back to my opening question about what policymakers don't understand about entrepreneurship, and most notably, the stages of development in a venture. What are the needs pre-startup? What are the needs startup and early operation? What are the needs as you adapt and develop a sustainable business model? What are the needs for growth? What is your perspective, not so much on policy that encourages people to start businesses, but is tailored to the needs of entrepreneurs at different stages of development?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Have you ever met a physician, a doctor, who says exercise and diet nutrition won't help you? It will actually hurt you? I bet you haven't.
No.
But I just went to one who said, whatever you do, don't exercise. I've got tendonitis of the foot. Said, don't exercise. What you're quoting from something I wrote had a particular context of what the policy goal was. This is my first statement. There's not one policy goal. In fact, in general, so if there's a very specific policy goal, inducing people to start businesses may not meet that goal. I'm not sure quite what that context is, but I know if you read most of my work, certainly Entrepreneurial Society, 1990, 2007, my general sense is it's like a doctor saying, you know what, exercise and nutrition is going to have a positive outcome. So I want to be very clear about this. But then I'm going to go back to and say, I think that when you said, yeah, the ecosystem seems not to be very focused, concerned, prioritizing poverty, I think you're surely right. It's not that the problem isn't the poverty. No, the problem is the poverty. But the problem goes back to what Lutetia said. It's our ecosystems or an ecosystem. It's not a homogeneous thing. One ecosystem is not the same as the other. Most of the ecosystems, both in practice, but also with the policy focus to the extent they exist, also the way that we academics characterize and think of them, they have a particular bias. And the bias is towards almost what João described for Portugal and for a lot of Europe. Now, there's a reason why, given the context we're in, but the bias is towards innovation, technology, growth, and productivity. I'm not going to say that's wrong, but it's like curing my tendonitis of the foot. That may not be what's going to work. So I would not say that the problem is the ecosystem context, or what Lutetia correctly said is kind of more the community or contextual, or João said, let's go back to the kind of spatial or regional industrial district. Yeah, that's right. It takes a community, but the priority, the focus, if you're focused on getting technology and innovation, scale up companies, that's a different kind of ecosystem that if you really take poverty seriously and go after poverty. I would say in this country, we haven't done that. I mean, to say we haven't done that it's a big country. But I think that policy responds to perceived problems, and the historical context for policy throughout, as I said, most of my lifetime, the problem going right back to in the field of entrepreneurship started with David Birch saying, it wasn't Birch saying we've got a problem with jobs. Birch responded saying, we've got a solution to the jobs crisis, entrepreneurship, small business. Well, we've got a different crisis now. You're right to say this, the panel's right. Poverty is the crisis, but that approach, therefore the ecosystem that it takes to get entrepreneurs to either create jobs or to create scale-ups, innovative jobs. I'm not against those, but it's a different ecosystem with different priorities, it's a different, and I don't think we've actually tried that, committed or prioritized that at all. Then my last point, Michael, is I think you've had a presumption, I think the discussion does, that says entrepreneurship to alleviate poverty has to come from the impoverished themselves. And I think that kind of defies lots of what we've learned about entrepreneurship, but to some degrees, just communities, which is to say, to the degree that we'll say non-impoverished people can create entrepreneurial opportunities, ventures in those communities, that can have a big spillover to externality effect, both in taking people out of poverty, but also influencing people in that community to become entrepreneurs themselves. So as I would say, let's not limit the discussion to only how can we make the impoverished, enable them to become entrepreneurs, but how can we actually induce entrepreneurs? I mean, look at Elon Musk. I'll just be neutral about him, but he's not going to impoverished communities. He's going to space. I'm certainly not against him going to Monterey. I'm not against anything, but why aren't we inducing, an army of young, talented people to try to address these challenges in poverty communities by putting their focus there. That says there's a role for not just the impoverished to become entrepreneurs, but also for others and to make a contribution that way. So I've said a lot in my response, which I'm not sure I ever answered your question.
I think, Benjamin, you've been trying to get a point in.
Yeah. I just wanted to say there is in Mexico certainly a large informal population, and both the informal sector and informal employment is very, very large. Now the question is, what is the main strategy for a government? We're going to talk about governments trying to improve this situation under the assumption that formal employment is generally better than informal employment, okay? So the question is whether these are steps that should be directed particularly at the informal employment sector, or they should emphasize much more changes in the formal sector. Okay, now, if you have low salaries, even in the formal sector of the economy, and you have all these, in Marxist terms, the reserved army of the proletariat is very big because all the informal sector is this reserve army of the proletariat, if you wish. Even when they produce under self-employment, they have a lower payment to their workers and so forth. So 25% of the informal employment takes place in formal places of employment in Mexico. So what you have to do, first of all, is take care of the formal sector in terms of the salaries they're paying, of their use of, people who produce for them in the informal sector, the few so-called enterprises that take place in the informal sector are producing mainly for the formal sector at a cheaper level. So it becomes functional for the system because you don't have policies of the government who actually improve the growth of the country, improve the growth of the formal economy, improve exports, etc., etc. So the main change that has to take place is to have policies that in which the formal sector is not based on lower labor costs, but on technological development, in which you have a system that does not increase the buying of things from the informal sector. You talk about entrepreneurs in the informal sector. Okay, so you have entrepreneurs, but they hire people at very low levels of income. The people there, by definition, don't have health insurance. They lower the cost for the formal sector. And I said already, people who work in the formal sector would not be able to buy in the economy if it was all formal. They buy in the informal sector, the toys for Christmas, the food that they eat every day, etc., are bought from the informal sector. And also, you have even the government employing people in the informal sector. So it has to be a policy that, first of all, still thinks in developing the formal sector of the economy as much as possible so as to increase employment in that sector. Right. This will be the main motor. This is said of countries like Mexico that have now opportunities with nearshoring, that have opportunities with the new world economy, and the opportunities are not being, particularly by this last government, are not being made use of. And that's why I think that the main emphasis has to be on policies that develop the formal sector, that bring it to growth. That is the main. Okay.
Yeah, I think we get that point. Thank you so much. I'm sensitive to time here. Letitia, I know you wanted to jump in, and please do, but could you also comment on, you've written some interesting work on redistributive policies, and I wondered if you might also touch on that.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you for that, Michael. I love the conversation that we're having today. It excites me. It's my passion. Now I'm going to go to your question specifically, Michael, right? So some of the work we looked at economic policies from 3 different places: distributive policies, which tend to bolster businesses by giving them financial incentives, which means the entrepreneur can redistribute their income and needs however they want rather than paying taxes. For instance, they can invest in the market they're trying to get into. There's redistributive, which try to redress historical deficiencies. So this is where we have welfare, affirmative action. Then there's also regulative, which try to maintain the order and try to direct human behavior, essentially. They try to disallow certain behaviors that could be threatening the intent of what a government might want to see happen in their ecosystem, happen in their economy. So, and Michael, you said you want me to address it from redistributive, which one?
Well, I'd rather you more just speak to what you think is the more relevant pathway.
So my colleagues and I had argued that depending on the context, all of those policies can work, right? And depending on the context, we might need to figure out how to put all those policies into play. And I think your prior question leads right into this, right? With, can we take a look at policies that are tailored to the different stages of entrepreneurship? So Benjamin addressed formal versus informal and brought up the point that we really should be targeting efforts in the formalized economy because it feeds over into the informal economy, but making sure that we are paying attention to the societal and the health benefits, the benefits that people who are in the informal economy actually need to feel like they can become formalized, all those things, right?
And quite a strong percentage of so-called informal businesses have degrees of formalization.
They do, right? They certainly do. I bring that up because it made me ask myself, okay, if I look at the context that I work in right now, that I study in, that I provide service in right now, right? My local Long Island communities. Can people in impoverished communities, how do they fit into these formalized, very structured organizations? Like, where have we seen these things falling apart, right? So if we're going to invest in formalized communities as one layer of different types of enterprises, then that means we have to invest in the talent pool that has to be able to access the job creation that these formalized enterprises are, that we think they're going to bring to our economy, right? On the other end, if we're looking at investing in entrepreneurship, starting at the different levels of entrepreneurship, so we're starting with nascent entrepreneurs, right? Then we're thinking about, all right, what do we need to do to train them to become entrepreneurs, to create the kind of entrepreneurship that leads to formalized enterprises that will then lead to the type of high growth, innovative businesses that we think will get us to more economic development, sustainable economic development, right? So, all right, we need some investment into these nascent entrepreneurs. This is probably going to come in the form of local support organizations who have to provide training to these entrepreneurs, then have to develop a pipeline that will take the entrepreneur out of being at the nascent stage to formalizing their business, to getting certified at some point in whatever industry they're going into, to understanding how to manage their back office and their front office, to understanding then how to handle contracts at varying levels. Now we're looking at growth entrepreneurship, because if once they're formalized, they want to grow. If they want to become more than just a small business, right? Now we're figuring out how do we get them to grow? How do we get them to provide more services, handle larger contracts, take on a larger staff? And that's a different level of policy that they need, because now we're talking about opening up market access. We're talking about opening up capital opportunities for them, right? And once they do that, then there's more scrutiny of the structure that they have in their enterprise. So that also requires some level of management support to that entrepreneur, right? If they didn't get it in their normal schooling, which many entrepreneurs don't, right? It's sort of something they learn after they've already started running the business. So a different type of policy is required there as well, right? And so you can see by that pathway of the entrepreneur starting the business to then being in a stage where they're growing the business, and then they're ready to tap out, right? So now there's succession planning. They're ready to transition into something else, or they're ready to hand that business over, or maybe the business is decreasing and they're coming to a stage where the business has to be closed, right? Different kind of policy is needed to support that entrepreneur too. How do you appropriately transition a business so that way all of the positive externalities that came from the business does not get lost in the business, that one business owner transitioning out? Can we maintain the business, or is the business dying, or can we pivot the business into something else, right? So all of these different stages require different levels of policy to help that, right? Certainly, I'll give you one example. There's a program that we do here at Long Island called Ascend Long Island. It's part of a national program that's sponsored by JP Morgan Chase. This is specifically targeting businesses that can manage large procurement contracts. So they have met revenues of $1 million or higher, and they can now take on large procurement contracts. We're working with them. We're figuring out, do you have the management system to handle this? Do you have access to capital? Do you have access to the right markets to be able to grow your business in this manner? That's the whole thing. We're bringing in the ecosystem partners to say, yes, we want to help get these businesses these contracts, right? What type of economic policy would this be? There's a few that we're working with. We have regulative policies in place. So these are the policies that say businesses that are dealing with a particular type of contract are mandated to hire vendors who have a certain amount of diverse businesses working with them, right? That's a regulative policy. We also have distributive policies at play here too, right? Because our government agencies, they've been providing tax incentives, they've been providing subsidies in different industries, right? So all of those policies can come into play in these different contexts, right? It just depends on what is needed. And right, I think we're all kind of recognizing that in this process. And how do we balance it? It's such a hard, tough question. How do we balance it? How do we get that balance and that combination of what is needed based off of the context, based off of the time, because we're all just transitioning through the pandemic. And so I think we have the right players.
Appreciate that. Yeah. So I Professor Lateo, you haven't had a chance to get in here, and I know David wants to jump in. Should we be focusing policies that target entrepreneurs themselves, their businesses, or should we be focusing policy on building these ecosystems that folks have been talking about?
If I'm allowed, both levels of policy, but in fact, this is more complex to approach. But using the perspective also provided by Lucy before, I think there is room also not only for redesigning redistribution policies. In my point of view, they need targets, and targets according to different types of entrepreneurship. I mean, it depends on what you want to stimulate, but with defined targets: female entrepreneurship, family entrepreneurship, ethnic entrepreneurship, inclusive entrepreneurship, arts entrepreneurship, circular entrepreneurship. I think with targets, with specific targets per groups, we can create a new cohesion mechanism that will reinforce the well-being. And it will contribute also for reducing structural unemployment and different types of inequalities. But what I am advocating here is not killing the informal sector. I mean, we need to have a balance. We need to keep informal and formal sector. And why is that so? Because if we kill informal sector, we won't get the right stimulus to different types of entrepreneurs, communities, families, to formalize those entrepreneurial initiatives. And then what we will for sure create is a non-favorable environment where families and different communities are not going to be involved. Just one last point. I think it could be crucial to create a new type of agent, which we could call the social innovator broker. And this could be associated with formal associations or even social enterprises that we have regulated in Europe, okay, just to get the right connection in the field. This type of social innovation broker will be the agent to get the different elements of the ecosystem into action. And that's all from my side.
Thank you. I do want to let David comment on this. Maybe, David, you could do so, but also we've been getting some good questions from the audience. Let me try to insert a question as well. Maybe you can do double duty. But we have a question: top-down government policy can have unintended consequences. Talks about microfinance regulation in India and the US. Policy succeeds only when top-down policies are in sync with grassroots efforts. I wonder if you might comment on that, David.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for the opportunity. And I like Letitia, I share her enthusiasm and excitement for this discussion. It turns out Michael's going to be the bad guy, the villain, to make us end before we want to end. But I want to circle back in answering that question in the previous discussion to your initial question, which is, do policymakers really know about, do they really understand entrepreneurship? And, you know, they say, you know, if you give a person a fish, they've got a meal for, you know, one meal. If you teach them to fish, they can nourish themselves for a long time. And I think that shows or suggests the importance of having policymakers who are literate, coherent, articulate, knowledgeable about the world of entrepreneurship ideas, just like they had to become with COVID. I think what we see are those communities in the world. I mean, I haven't seen a study at all. It's a great research idea. Those communities in the world that seem to have responded entrepreneurial over the last decades, I think we can also see there's a policy community that is, they speak English. Well, that's, you know, we've seen a change. No, the point is, yeah, they're knowledgeable about entrepreneurship. I think in particular of the Nordic countries where there's been a big transformation. My sense is in interactions, they also understand entrepreneurship. They take it seriously. They're committed to it. I think we see that in countries or contexts like Singapore, Taiwan, certainly other communities that in Bilbao, Spain has had lots of examples. But that says, I think that, you know, I don't know about your own experience, Michael, to what degree does your own teaching, your own focus include policy makers. I know in this country, there's probably too much of a mentality that puts policy and entrepreneurship as dichotomy, actually in opposition. And this is problematic. Remember the famous joke that got Ronald Reagan, you will remember, maybe nobody else on the screen, that got Ronald Reagan elected as president. As he'd go around, he'd say, "Hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help." And everybody would laugh. Well, right there, that says, don't look to governments for solutions. All these wonderful examples Letitia's giving us, that say, no, don't even look there. That's just going to be a source of a problem. That preempts even the idea that government and policy should be part of a solution, therefore should be aware, have a sensitivity to, be educated. I think that's an enormous opportunity to enhance or address impoverished communities and poverty globally, that says, look, the people who are part of this, either ecosystem or community, who have a great opportunity to be part of the solution. The question's surely right. They have to have congruence between the top of policy and then the hands-on for policy. I think that's true whether you're talking about treating COVID, treating education, but certainly for education, but certainly true for entrepreneurship as well. And right now, there's a void. There's a great community in education in policy for addressing poverty. I don't think they talk about entrepreneurship much at all. As I say, I think entrepreneurship's seen as the problem, not even a provider solution. That's the opportunity to bring these worlds together. But it does say that entrepreneurship has to become a tool. Policymakers have to become literate in entrepreneurship.
Thank you for that. We are, as you noted, down on time. And this is such a rich conversation, could go in so many more directions. I wonder if I could ask each of you, to the extent that entrepreneurship can be a pathway out of poverty, and to the extent that policy can play some role, is there one particular overriding policy recommendation that you would make? Benjamin, can we start with you?
Well, just because the question is so general, I have to try to make it into a concrete example. In the case of Mexico, the way you show your priorities, you express your priorities as a government, is where do you make the effort, where do you invest the money, etc., etc. Okay, this is the main question. If you force me to answer about priorities, I think the priority is in the development of the formal economy. I think the development of the formal economy is what will reduce the informal sector, the only way to reduce it. It means, for instance, also to control to a greater extent if the private sector of the economy, in the formal economy, is actually increasing the informality by contracting, buying from informal companies that have lower prices for the products, etc., and everybody knows that they can do that because they have workers for which they don't have to pay any social security, any of that would convert them into formal employees. The government would have to start, for instance, by not having informal workers working for the government itself, but by formalizing them. And the way to formalizing them in the Mexican case is to include them in the health system, and second, guaranteeing pensions for them. If this is not done as a policy that comes from up, entrepreneurship may help but I think that it cannot substitute, that cannot be the solution for the problems in the informal sector. I already said that we had a government that for 6 years called its economic policy changarization, which means the improvement of small business in the informal sector, etc. So that, in other words, Mexico has tremendous opportunities. I'm talking about Mexico because this is the case that I studied the most. Mexico has nearshoring, investment from the United States, a large capitalist class with the ability to pay higher taxes, which they don't pay, etc., etc. And these are more central than the issue of entrepreneurship in the informal sector itself. That's
Understood.
the way.
Thank you. Down on time, but Leticia, an overarching sort of thing that's at the top of your list?
Yeah, I'm gonna play the long game here. Especially for the United States, we need to invest in our talent pool. I think if we do better at educating our younger students, we'll see better investments in both our formal economy, even those that go informal first, right? If they are better educated on the front end, what comes out on the later end is just increased productivity, increased ability to deal with the challenges life is going to throw at them. And so that's my policy. Let's invest in that talent pool where they are right now.
Thank you, Leticia. And Professor Lateo?
Yes, if I am allowed, two suggestions. One less polemic, because I follow Lucy. It would be to foster entrepreneurial education for civic and societal impact. This should be a priority for all the governments in the world, starting at 3 years old and moving into 100 years at least. Okay? So this is a way of living entrepreneurship. A second one, it would be to create a minimum social income target to entrepreneurial initiatives. This could be something that we could discuss more. And well, this is just a suggestion. I know, polemic, but anyway, I would like to deliver it.
Well, I think that's quite intriguing, the idea of sort of income subsidy tied to maybe progress and venture development. So David, you get the last word.
Boy, what Benjamin's all of my colleagues say, it's you're putting us in a tough bind. One thing, and no, I've got to say two. And in a way, I'm going to combine what Yoa and Leticia said with what Benjamin said. Benjamin's surely right. Look, Milton Friedman said you vote with your feet in capitalism, democracy. Yeah, but you put your money where your priorities are. He's right. That's always the case. I mean, it doesn't have to be enormous, but it speaks. But the other thing is what Leticia's been saying a lot, culture matters. Idea. And if you don't win the hearts, you can win the pocketbooks, but if you don't win the hearts of people to get buy-in participation. So I'm going to say two things, which is now what does that mean for the instruments of policy? It means lots of things, but it means allocate resources and change the culture.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for this fascinating conversation. I know there's a level of frustration because there's so much packed in here and how much could be unpacked much more fully. I do want to thank all of our attendees, our audience, for being with us today. I'm sorry I couldn't get to more of your questions. Some of them were effectively answered as we went. And I want to invite everybody who's interested to join the Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship. There is no cost. Simply send me an email and we're happy to add you to the group. Again, thanks to everybody and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.